Welcome to Objective Recovery. Today we are diving into a topic that feels especially close to home for me, having a mind that works a bit differently and the strengths and challenges that come with it. My guest is Noah Healy, a recreational mathematician working on a new market design that aims to upgrade economics by making production and stability more profitable. Noah, thanks for being here. So let me start with your tagline, recreational mathematician. I found it very interesting because it's not something that we hear very often. So would you explain to us what it means?
Absolutely, yeah. So it is sort of a shame that we don't hear it so often. We've professionalized math to a great extent, but recreational is when you're doing it for fun. And quite a lot of the very important mathematics that has been developed because somebody got interested in some kind of a question. Fermat's last theorem is perhaps one of the most famous ideas in mathematics, and rather famously about it's been almost 30 years at this point. Andrew Wiles actually solved it and got the $1 million prize that somebody had staked out if anybody actually solved the thing. Fermat was not a professional mathematician. He was interested in mathematics. He corresponded about it. He actually proved several important things that we use in cryptography today. But he was a lawyer, and he used to argue with Descartes, who was more of a professional mathematician about various mathematical things. And Descartes was not always correct in their arguments. If you decide to find mathematics enjoyable, it can be a rewarding and intriguing hobby.
I absolutely agree with that. So did you actually study it at school beyond the basic education, or you really developed all your knowledge, your experience recreationally, just following your passion?
I absolutely studied in school. I took at least one math class in every year of my primary and secondary education. So
Mhm.
I've taken something like 17 collegiate math classes over the years. The area of math that I got very interested in is something that I picked up as studies that I was doing as part of my profession. So I didn't really get into computers while I was in school. I got into them afterwards, and in learning about programming languages, and very specifically the actual programming language that were used at at the first company I was at, and then the second company, and so on. I got into learning about compilers, parsers, regular expressions, and a bunch of this other sort of deep computational ideas, and that really sparked my interest. It's a very unique kind of little corner because it's this thing where the thing that we know is that we don't know basically everything. It's this unbelievably vast unknown space that virtually none of which we'll ever be able to encounter because it's actually impossible to do so. But there's stuff in there that we can get to, and so it's very exciting.
Studying or figuring out the underlying principles beyond everything and using that knowledge, applying that knowledge to solve problems. So you mentioned that the one of the primary inspirations was computational approaches. So would you say that you are more interested in applied mathematics than purely theoretical? Do you like the idea of solving problems in general with it, or it can be anything and you are just passionate about basically how it works?
I do like solving problems. The computational idea is one of the particularly interesting things is that it becomes at least theoretically possible to wholly solve problems. The entire basis of Alan Turing's work on computation was what they called at the time mechanizing integer arithmetic. So the idea is that the kind of arithmetic that we teach to, kids in like kindergarten and first grade is very obviously simpler than the kinds of math we teach to college students. And so there must be some mechanism that would allow us to completely operationalize that so that I could just hand you one of these problems and that machine would solve it for you. What Turing figured out is that it actually isn't simpler than the kind of math we actually teach college students mostly, that integer arithmetic as opposed to real arithmetic was actually Turing complete, that all conceivable computations could be expressed in it. Therefore, we could never fully mechanize it, although we could build machines that could do everything that we could imagine, but we would not be able to work out what the frontier of our imagination would look like. And so we get the modern computer, which again is capable of anything we can imagine. And we're seeing, particularly now with the explosion of these creative AIs, just how weak our imaginations really are. We have not seen a sudden and radical explosion of entirely new modes of thought and ideas and art and so on. We've seen a lot of reshuffling of what was popular basically 40 seconds ago.
I always find it so interesting that whenever I meet someone who is so passionate about mathematics and computer science and this, so I meet a lot of people through my own profession. But probably, if you recall, even your own childhood, I imagine that most of the kids were not like didn't have this as a primary passion. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, even you saying, bringing up that mathematics is actually very creative, and we can use it for creative problem solving, not just describing things. And that's also not many people associate, but many people associate with it. They find it very dry and very like linear, which is very far from the reality, I think.
Well, yeah, mathematics is a language, and it's actually sort of
Yeah.
a series of languages that are all, to some degree, perfectly co-translatable. So, like, imagine if we taught language the way we taught mathematics, where we, kind of forced people to answer incredibly simplistic self-fulfilling questions over and over again. And then one day we said, okay, now it's time for you to write Shakespeare's plays. Then had you copy them out by hand. And then after doing those two things, they were like, okay, you're a mathematician, like go use language now. And you'd be like, I've never done that before.
It's very interesting that you compare it to language, and I agree. And I also sometimes would compare it to even art. That in terms of, because the way I saw one thing that when I was at school, I was also math was also one of my favorite subjects, and so I was just thinking why when I was preparing in mind for this conversation, and I think before I even became very aware of actually really the deeper levels why. One reason why was that I passionately hated having to memorize things and exams, traditional schooling. I mean, I was at school like 30 years ago. It was a long time ago. Luckily, the school systems are more innovative, at least part of it now. But back then, we had to memorize a lot of things. And so in math, that was not necessary too much of a requirement, so we could just resolve these, process these problems mentally on the spot and still do well. And I figured out that I did well, so I ended up liking it, and I did more and more and more, and that was my story with it. But I think it definitely takes some specific mental processes. So just one thing to share with the audience here is that the reason we are here together with Noah is that I saw you first on another podcast, saw you speaking, and I thought that you were really excellent at really processing very complex pieces of information and really complex questions and making the answers very clear and going through many different stages and combining different pieces of information together and expressing it in a form that was quite creative, I found. So I found that very interesting because I love that mental process. My brain also, my mind works that way also very much. So we often call this abstract reasoning, which is basically just an ability to think logically and make connections between ideas without needing direct reference from experience.
Yeah. That's always been one of my gifts with the mathematics. That gives you the ability to really exercise it. So it's sort of the thing that I work on, as opposed to, most of the other aspects of life, frankly.
How do you find it when you talk to others who don't have the similar training background, similar math propensity and knowledge and all that? Do you find it difficult sometimes to explain these things or to make them understand, even just to get them excited? Is there anything like that?
It helps a great deal to be in person so that you can
Mhm.
kind of watch the eyes glaze and change what you're talking about. I also try to use examples from the other person's background when I'm aware of it. I was at a networking thing earlier this year, and there was a woman there who was a recent graduate from, I live in a college town. I'm here in Charlottesville, and UVA's right there. She was a recent graduate studying neuromedicine, and I'm not a brain surgeon, but I had biology. I know a little bit about neuroanatomy, and I start dropping examples of, like how brains work. And there's a lot of that information again. Well, some of it's a lot hinky, frankly, but there's been a lot of work around the neural net AIs to do what they call biomimicry. In many cases, it's not. It's just, some sort of made up metaphor for what they're doing. But in some cases it is. And so, I had some of that. And I dropped like the third one. She got this weird look on her face and was like, have you studied neuroanatomy? I was like, no, no. It's like, well, how do you know all this stuff then? It's like, I just graduated. Like it's already fallen out of my brain, and you're here doing this. So yeah, you gotta kind of temper. That's part of the problem, and a lot of what I do isn't really new discovery. It's trying to keep up with how many discoveries are all going on and integrating those things
Okay.
into an understanding. I'm just finding ways to explain these complicated ideas to, my simple brain, and then I have this simple understanding that I can give to other people, because once it's clear, then you can clarify.
I remember that also for me when I was in like high school level, and I very briefly considered taking it to a more serious level and developing like a professional interest from it. But I was turned off by the fact that what kind of job can I get with it? And at the time, again, it was 30 years ago. It's we don't have, as at least especially in my home country environment in Eastern Europe, we didn't have all these opportunities. So it's a good era to live in now with this kind of interest. I would like to go back to you a bit and to really dive into how your mind works and how you operate in your life with this kind of abilities. So you shared with me before that you sometimes have these communication problems when you need to explain your work, or so I don't know actually what that is. So would you just give a simple example, maybe from something very recent? What type of communication problem?
Well, I'm having a severe communication problem with the U.S. government at the moment.
Okay.
So that's sort of a big deal. I'm trying to patent the work you'd mentioned earlier on coming up with this better marketplace. Essentially, I'm patenting a machine that would be useful for that context. there's certainly a lot of room for interpretation and so on. Unfortunately, the U.S. Patent Office has adopted a set of standards that is fairly amorphous superficially, but they're using it in a way that is extremely poor. And so they have, and this has been going on for half a decade at this point, they have made a number of assertions which are simply impossible.
Mm.
They have declared that time could be measured without clocks, that 1 equals 2, that arithmetic doesn't exist. It's pretty insane. These are difficult ideas to get across.
Mhm.
So I sued them in federal court,
Mm.
and you only have a limited amount of space, and so I basically put together a mathematical proof that they had made about half a dozen different assertions, which were all impossible, and that those assertions are the basis of their case, and so their case has to be tossed out. And the court basically looked at all of that and described it as unpersuasive. Um,
Mm.
so I'm now trying to pull together a petition to ask the Supreme Court whether or not that constitutes basically acceptable process. So there's a concept. It comes down to this thing called the APA, which is a rule about how judges are supposed to work. Judges have to provide a logical explanation for their decisions. And so
Mhm.
declaring that logic isn't persuasive, I feel, does not come to the standard of providing a logical explanation for a decision, but I need to figure out how to explain that to the United States Supreme Court, in the hopes that they will decide that they are actually interested in even answering that question, because they mostly don't. There's a lot of people ask them questions. They mostly ignore them. That's very challenging. Explaining a 5-year timeline of multiple contradictory and impossible assertions that are then answered with mathematical proofs that they're impossible is not something I have found a way to compactify and simplify. And I kind of need to figure this out in the next month and a half, because I need to do it in writing to SCOTUS.
Yeah, so I can see that why it's difficult on many different levels. So do you think that they just misunderstood your submission, your patent submission in the first place? Is that how you have already started? That they didn't understand what it was fully. They put things together in the wrong way, or was it because of some conflicts with the system, with the larger system?
There certainly was some confusion in the beginning. Some of that is not even their fault. I had attorneys at the beginning, and they explained that you basically want to be too vague and ask for too much up front and let them kind of pull things back
Yeah,
from
yeah.
there. And so I was very uncomfortable with the first
I
draft
know, I know, yeah.
that went out. I was like, this is pretty. It was like, and they were like, no, 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 no. This is just how things will work. In sort of the dance, I was the first person to step on their toes. They indicated that certain things would have been acceptable, and those things were too narrow. I insisted on a kind of different kind of generalization than the one that they had signaled that they would accept. But we went through a few different back and forths. It took around 4 years to get to the acceptance in the first place.
Oh, it was accepted in the first
Yeah,
place.
so my patent application received a notice of acceptance in the fall of 2020.
Okay.
And then they proceeded to not grant that patent on the basis of that notice of acceptance. And instead, they needed time They didn't sort of go in good order. They were like, we know we're not doing this. We haven't figured out why yet. We'll get back to you with why we aren't doing our legally required job. And the thing that they came out with was that they weren't going to grant it because it was useless, which is the
Oh.
first of these impossible assertions. It's basically trivial, using a mechanism that the US government themselves advertises as the most basically trivial systems analysis tool there is. It's called Big O notation. It's been around for more than a century. Donald Knuth proposed teaching it to school kids so that we could teach calculus in grade school, and not like high school, but like to ninth graders or to 9-year-olds and stuff. If you apply Big O to the patent description that they're looking at, it becomes perfectly obvious that you can reduce the physical requirements of existing markets by a factor of millions if you want to. That's pretty insane. I was at a presentation by the SEC's chief data officer, and according to him, the Securities and Exchange Commission has an exabyte of information on hand for their regulatory duties. So, for if you're not familiar, if you've heard of terabytes, we're getting into the range where that's about where hard drives are. 1,000 of those is a petabyte, and 1,000 petabytes is an exabyte. So they've got basically 1 million hard drives worth of data that is just all of the relevant and obviously mostly irrelevant information required to keep track of whether or not the markets are functioning in a manner that is legal. So if you took that down by a factor of millions, rather than having 1 million hard drives, you could have one, and that would search a lot faster, be much, much easier to cope with. Obviously incredibly useful. So that was that. They gave me a second notice of acceptance. They then withdrew that one 3 weeks later. Oops, sorry, we didn't mean to say it was useless. We actually meant to say that it was too useful, that you're patenting fundamental economics. This is also untrue. It's a more convoluted argument this time, but effectively they already handed out a patent on fundamental economics, and they already agreed that that patent has nothing to do with what I'm doing. So they've already messed that up, basically. Since then, they've responded at each stage by ignoring that they were wrong the last time and making new and impossible assertions for why they're going to do things the next time. And in the most recent one, to some extent, they did that again. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit declared that proof that they were wrong is unpersuasive. That's what I'm coping with right now.
Yes, so it's probably they had problems understanding the conceptual like design and then the application, and then later on they are now just looking for reasons to reject it, and that's why they are contradicting themselves. Maybe that's how. Is the communication written, or do you get the chance to talk to them directly, like on the phone or virtual meetings, video meetings as well?
So in this case, it's all written communication so far. I did have the opportunity to correspond with my attorneys, but when I had attorneys, the patent office operates in a way that you're only allowed to have a single point of contact. And so if you have an attorney, they will talk to your attorney and they will not talk to you. When I ran out of money, I had to take my attorneys off the case, get them to file paperwork so that they were out, so that I could talk to them. They have an ombuds office. You can call them up and ask them questions. They have incredibly limited ability to sort of deal with things. And in the course of the legal proceedings, I did have to talk to their attorney at one point, or one of their attorneys at one point. The way it works is you put in a case, they put in a rebuttal, you optionally can rebut their rebuttal if you want to, and then there is a sort of file, they call it an appendix, that just has all of the information that the case references. So if something happened during the patent, it's all online, and in fact, all of every piece of correspondence between my attorney's office and the patent office is online, and there's a web page where you can download each of the PDFs. I actually added a few things to that file, including mathematical papers by Haskell Curry and Claude Shannon and Alan Turing, and a few others. And from what I've been able to tell, this is the first time in the history of the United States that the actual definitions of computational and informational mathematics have been made accessible to the federal court system, which makes it even more disappointing that they chose to be entirely unresponsive. It is generally well accepted in the computer community that the US, all of the intellectual property systems have been doing an extremely poor job of coping with the existence of computers and the internet. And fairly sophisticated, although, obviously not on the front page of the New York Times or openly debated on the Sunday shows or what, that's not where any of it is.
Yeah, so it's definitely the legal system definitely does not appreciate or is, just giving them for free or is, information. And probably it's a part of the problem is that your mind and your values, because the values and, your standards are probably generated, not probably, they are generated by, how your brain works, how your mind works, how you process information, how you deal with processes, how you execute. And, the mainstream is a bit different. So this leads me to a question that so since we here on this podcast we talk a lot about mental health and the underlying differences, individual differences, brain differences that are related to mental health or problems with mental health. So one thing that is very popular these days is neurodiversity and neurodivergence, and we spoke about this a bit when we first met.
I was tested extensively. I'm of an age where giving everybody IQ tests was a fairly standard part of pedagogy. I was specifically identified as having not any of the things that are presently kind of in that neurodivergence umbrella under current DSMs, but having very specific differences, I guess. So I was classified as being dyslexic, and they described it as an IQ gap. So sort of basic thing, IQ tests. The reason the concept of IQ exists is that people, Francis Galton, he's a famous guy, basically invented weather forecasting and the dog whistle, and he's Darwin's cousin.
Yeah.
He got into measuring people. One of the things he was potentially interested in was measuring intelligence, and there were a lot of ideas about whether or not there would be, how would intelligence work, and what was discovered. So his mathematical contribution was correlation. He's the person who worked out correlation for the first time. Psychologists discovered as they started measuring up human beings is that to a very powerful extent, everything that you might constitute as intelligence positively correlated. There weren't, in sort of the abstract, people that were smart at one thing and dumb at another thing. Yes, there were some very, very outliery folks that, got hit in the head and then could play the piano, or, like that's a thing that's been with us forever. And you hear stories about that like today as well. But most people, if they're smart, they're smart, and if they're dumb, they're dumb, and that's more or less the way it works. And it's very powerful. And so what this means is that when you test, IQ tests consist of large numbers of collections of questions on a bunch of different subjects and a bunch of different modalities. They have puzzles that you put together with your hands and, other things where you're supposed to visualize spinning three-dimensional objects and stuff. The outcome from all of these is supposed to be roughly correlated. And so if you're the kind of person, and this is apparently the kind of person I am, where they are not roughly correlated and in fact are wildly discorrelated,
Mm-hmm.
then the standard rules that will allow them to put an IQ number. So like that guy who got hit in the head and can suddenly play piano, the IQ test doesn't work for him.
Yeah.
And that's apparently the kind of person I am, where the
Mm-hmm.
IQ
Yeah.
test does not quite work for me. I'm above average in most things, and the thing that I'm really, really good at is logical reasoning.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to run your life on logical reasoning.
Yeah.
I'm certainly having a lot of difficulty with it. I have to ask the Supreme Court whether or not they're willing to accede that they're not running their lives on logical reasoning,
Yeah.
which is to some extent the public nature of what they say their job is. So hopefully they'll be willing to dip a toe.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I meant. So it's different from the mainstream, and then it causes all these communication problems. So that first of all, I am also I've never been a big fan of the classic IQ test, even though I usually do very well on them in terms of like scores. But it's also like there are, as you said, there are domains that are really out. For example, I tend to do really poorly on anything that requires spatial orientation, and even in real life I can't orient driving or these things. It just doesn't work very well for me. But also human communication requires so much more than so many other things than reasoning and logic. And so you didn't even bring up, for example, how people make decisions based on momentary emotional states, and everything that is driven by emotion, and this mainstream society and the system that we live in. It's definitely very far from something that was built upon analytical, straightforward logic. And so I can very easily see, you mentioned also the dyslexia. So especially that's why I asked this question: if you have to write, to communicate with them, that I imagine that might also cause issues. That if you are not at your best,
Yeah,
especially explaining this. Now it's getting more and more complicated, and I guess they want more simpler and simpler explanations, and that's not where it's going. So it's diverging instead of converging, probably, right?
yeah, it's been very convenient that LLMs have gotten sort of
Right.
big, popular, and available right now. I have trained myself to be conversationally capable, and so I can get the LLMs to produce things that are stylistically acceptable as a file to hand off to a court system. It is quite the challenge though, because the LLMs are exceptionally bad at meticulously detailed background information. Um,
Yeah.
they very much are sort of keeping a collective average of the background information, and so I have to be very attentive to make sure that their tendencies to want to hallucinate is the term that we use,
Yeah.
does not infect things, and
Yeah.
that's quite the trial. If you criticize it's called the Alice test. It's sort of the last time the Supreme Court said something about what would and would not be patentable. If you go to basically every LLM I've checked and uh, ask it about the Alice test, and then bring up Kolmogorov, Turing, Curry, Shannon, De Bruyn, it will pretty much just spit out the exact argument that I gave them. So it's sort of amusing that this path is so well worn, LLMs will actually do it pretty much correctly, and yet it's entirely outside of the experience of the system that really needs it.
Yeah, the problem is that we are not rewarded for having this, logical precision, and you are making your explanations clearer and clearer, and more and more reasonable, and arguing that in that way with an unreasonable system. So that so that's why I think there is no other way, that we need to get help. I'm sure you are getting help from, you mentioned the attorneys. And so, for example, when I was a young scientist, I did a lot what we use in a scientific method, logic and reasoning. And when I started really more seriously doing businesses and selling, the skills that I very appreciated in science just actually were very counterproductive in business very often, because you have to explain things briefly to the point, knowing what they want, and giving them what they want. That's part of selling, right? Even selling to customers. And so I also would like to ask you about, so this was one example where it's difficult to different communication styles where they clash, to get somewhere, to get to a goal. Are there other areas of your life for you where similar things come up, and it's not so easy to handle communicating with people or anything else?
Not being a writer takes a lot of things off the table. Texting, for example, something that I think it's the worst development in human history.
For you.
Well, certainly for me, but I like to think that it's bad for the rest of you too.
Yeah.
Have you heard the tale of where texting came from? My understanding is that texting actually grew out of a fad by Japanese teenagers. That the pagers were developed. Teenagers developed a technique that would allow them to text to write numbers that could be clearly understood as words, as short things to their friends. And so they would go to payphones and page their friends with text messages. And the friend would also be at a different payphone, and they would conduct conversations at, a dime per information. And that's why texts were insanely expensive until the BlackBerry, figured out how to do it through email instead. We're looking at a communication fad growing up among children who don't really have their entire brains.
Developed, yeah.
Yeah, developing this hyper expensive, hyper restrictive over actually being in each other's presence. Um, it's sort of a corporate dream that, like, for people to be atomized and be forced to pay for every scrap of connection. But yeah, for me personally, it's just utterly.
You don't like texting.
Yes.
You try to avoid. I also dislike it intensely. But for me, it's more not the actual writing. I actually personally really I love writing, but I like it exactly because then I have the opportunity to really explain. I can go into things in depth. And texting culture, this superficial, where even the sloppy language, that's something that I intensely hate. I guess it's generations. So probably younger people are more comfortable with this, text speak and that kind of language. And so it's definitely also I can relate to that as well. And so anything else so how about when you just speak with people in your environment, in your 3D environment around you in real life? Is it easier for you when you mentioned in the beginning, I think that it's easier sometimes when you speak face to face?
Yeah, conversation is generally a lot easier for me, and it's the thing that I've sort of practiced being good at. So I've got a fair degree of interest there. But sure, I mean, when you spend your time on such esotericism, there's not a lot of common interest and understanding, and that's an enormous fraction of communication. If you took two people and raised each of them in a box and made their environments completely disconnected from one another, then those two people would have a very difficult time relating once you let them out of the boxes. And I've spent my life in one of these very disconnected environments,
Okay.
deeply studying math and physics, and some other things as well. And there's not a lot of people over here. There's a few interesting ideas, and some of them would be very useful for the rest of you.
Yeah.
But it's pretty difficult to re-bridge the divide and sort of go back and figure out like how to make that happen.
Did you ever have anything really like serious? Many people, for example, I spoke with people who have really serious mental health issues, like serious depression and other anxiety that is really paralyzing for them. As a result of this, they figure out in early life that they don't fit in. They don't. They have communication problems, and they develop because they just don't. They are not able to learn how to function in this different world.
So for me, that didn't really happen because I seem to be basically a loner, and
Okay.
so not connecting uh, in standard ways to sort of the kids that I was hanging around with
Okay.
was fine, because I wanted to, go take walks in the woods or whatever instead. So I wasn't going to be connecting with them in the first place. It is getting like this whole being in court, you know, on my own, that's been very stressful. And there's been some physiological like returns on that have
Okay.
not been great. But for the most part, I find the physical environments that humans prefer physically uncomfortable. Like I'm a little under the weather, and that's why I've got a sweater on. But generally, I like it to be fairly cool. Um,
Mhm.
I have a hypersensitive olfactory. I don't really like anything to smell like anything.
Yeah.
Sort of. I grew up next to a pine forest and a bamboo forest, and so absolutely clean, fresh air is sort of the only thing I
Mhm.
ever want to smell. Very loud noises. I get a little freaked out, um, because I can feel the sort of vibrations in the air.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so it's just like the things that people do for fun, um, don't don't physically work for me, and so I don't do any of those things for fun. I do other things that are sadly solitary. Like again, taking walks in the woods, or studying math. But
Mhm.
because of that, I've always seemed to be pretty well put together. Like the when you get onto the learning disabled track in my schools, uh, they would retest you psychologically and IQ and the rest of it, at frequent intervals. So I had something like half a dozen psych evals
Yeah.
during
Yeah.
my childhood, which is a little higher. Even sort of regular schooling hands out a few of them, but when they catch something, they do a lot more on top of that. And
Mhm.
I found the depression questions mostly confusing. Like it sounds really horrifying what apparently people go through. I wouldn't want to. And
Okay, so you don't experience that. That's excellent. That's great done. Yeah, it's actually what you mentioned about being alone, sort of because you are not interested because you don't find easily people who find similar activities and rewarding and interesting, and then you are fine on your own, because that's a primary reason why, it contributes to depression and, isolation. And for many people, that's very negative. I can relate to this loner thing as well, because I won't go into that now, but very much, very similar in many ways. It's actually, for me, one thing I will share, for me, that's why part of the reason why I'm so into my work and have always been throughout my life is because that's the main domain of life where I can connect with the rest of the world easily, because if you choose what you work on, then you have those opportunities. Unfortunately, for people who just want to get a job just to survive, and they work jobs that they don't jobs don't align with them, they don't have this, they don't develop this positive area of life that works very well. I definitely don't often speak with people who share with me that for them, being a loner and spending most of the time alone, and with all these our own passions and mathematics and things like that, and it's not a problem. And I feel exactly the same way, and I felt in my whole life I like my ideas to have more direct, like larger applications. And so then I choose to work on problems relevant for many people, such as mental health. But it's actually, I would say it's a gift, because it's probably, you don't feel lonely. People suffer so much for being lonely and for being disconnected, and it's not necessarily a problem. Although you mentioned that there have been some issues, you mentioned physiological issues. Would you say a few words about that? Any health problems or anything?
Health problems are occurring. My blood pressure and my heart rate have both spiked in the course of this year,
Mhm.
and I'm
Okay.
doing some things to try to get that back under control. At the beginning of the year, I'm a reasonably frequent blood donor, and
Mhm.
I actually almost was turned away from a donation because my heart rate was too high. I was sort of able to kind of relax and meditate a little bit and get it under. But then during the donation, I kind of follow the directions. I donate reasonably quickly. I was donating unreasonably quickly, as it turned out, and they had to remove the tourniquet to get me to start bleeding slowly enough. If you bleed too quickly, you can become lightheaded and pass out.
Yeah.
Nothing like that happened. I've never had an incident in many gallons now of that sort of thing happening to me. But they were worried, and sort of I checked, and it appears to be a stress response.
Yeah.
My body is just jacked up, because my government has declared that it has no interest in the truth. And
Yeah.
that's very stressful.
Do you think that there may be other lifestyle related reasons as well? So, for example, this is also something that I can relate to a bit. Not the blood pressure, my heart rate. My heart rate like varies a lot, and it gets spiked by even conversation like this before we start. I sometimes check my heart rate just for fun, because I know this now, and then I want to see the patterns. And if I have to log on to a conversation like this, it's like get sky high. It's not just going to the doctors, and it's just it creates a lot of variability. But my blood pressure is usually fine. And so one thing that I'm trying to work on now, actually, this year more, is seeing if it's related to other aspects of my lifestyle, and how I live, exercise, diet, and all this. Do you think that there may be anything like that in your case?
Oh, it almost certainly is. Yeah, I definitely could do a lot more, and I'm trying to get around to that. But you have different priorities, and
Yeah,
yeah, arguing with LLMs so that you can argue with faceless bureaucrats is not a healthy way to live, certainly.
yeah,
And that is quite the challenge for me these days.
And even there are the studies, so we spoke before about the social aspect, social connections, and there are many studies these days showing even that, basically, human species is, we evolved as a social species. And so if we remove those social connections that cause stress by on its own, actually, I studied that, I use that in behavioral research as a model that we would stress at usually animals, not necessarily humans, even for an hour, or like rodents, rats and mice that are also very social, and you can see the consequences of that, socialization, isolation, stress. And I think it's part of it is that, at least for me, I often think that, this being alone, spending so much time alone, because I don't feel that I need, all the social connections all the time or as much as many other people. Maybe I feel that it's enough for me, but it's another question is that what is our biological system designed for, evolved for, and sometimes there is a disconnect between what we perceive, what we are aware of, consciously, than what actually this complicated body system. How it operates optimally. And so sometimes that's actually what we are, one of the main areas that we are helping people to figure out with objective recovery, to tap into those unconscious elements of, their life, who they are, how they think, their emotional landscape. And, when they have serious problems, they usually come to us or to their mental health provider because they have some serious mental health condition. And it's very, very often the case that there is this disconnect between what we are aware of and what is behind it. And speaking, you spoke about the computer systems. So very often we compare it to in the brain, the human brain, and the consciousness. Actually, it's like a computer, but most of the computation is done in the unconscious, what we call the unconscious mind. We are not aware of it, and it's designed beautifully to serve survival, because we're able to make quick decisions unconsciously. And when there is a danger, we have to respond very quickly. Stress. Speaking of stress, I think that can be an interesting challenge to figure out in terms of mental health, if there are some underlying, causes.
I providently have a great deal of family. I live in the same town as my parents, so we just had Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
I I spend most of my time alone, but I am not lonely.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's important. But it is an issue. It's it becomes extremely difficult for systems to cope with self-awareness. And so, yeah, that it, particularly if you've gotten yourself into a condition where you're locked into a cycle that is counterproductive,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a thing that it feels like for me I'm coping with,
Yeah.
because the reason end of things is solid, like that they are wrong. They do not argue that they're not wrong. The good news for me, to some extent, is that I'm fairly near the end of the process. The Supreme Court either will or won't hear the issue, and if they hear the issue, they'll issue a decision that says something, and they are the final court of appeal. So no matter what happens in the next couple months to a year, it will be over. And I won't have to concern myself either with a system that has demonstrated itself incapable of functioning in the world that we live in, or one that has a future. And that's not up to me, it's up to them.
Yeah, I really hope it works out well for you. Is there anything that you are currently working on in your life that where you want to grow?
This is pretty much the purpose of my life these days, and has been for about a decade. It would be great if I got finished and got to sort of work on something
Okay, so
else.
you're really focused on it. So is there any way that the public could have, for example, the viewers of this podcast and could help you? And if so, how can people find you?
A popular movement is enough to cause something like this to happen. So if you're interested in these ideas, CoreDis.com has some resources to explain what it is that I'm working on. You can
Mhm.
also reach out to me personally, Noah P. Healy at Yahoo, or on LinkedIn. Connect pretty regularly with people. If you have any kinds of skills about creating global viral movements, or anything else that might contribute to there being a future, yeah, let me know. Let's have a chat about it. If you're just curious, I'm happy to answer any questions. Go look, and again, it takes a couple of steps because the LLMs are all getting very conventionalized. But if you ask an LLM about coordinated discovery markets as invented by Noah Healy, they'll give you descriptions that aren't really all that false of what's
Mhm.
going on, because it's in the public eye, and you can find it out there. I would encourage people to go do that and get the party started.